What if one of music's most haunting disappearances was never meant to be solved? For decades, the mysterious downfall of gospel legend Dottie Rambo has echoed in silence, fueled by rumors, half-truths, and a faith community too afraid to dig deeper. Every attempt to piece together her tragic legacy has only blurred the truth, burying it beneath nostalgia and denial. But now, an unlikely thread, traced through private letters and forgotten recordings, has shattered the myth entirely. It's real, it's disturbing, and it changes everything we thought we knew. The Dottie Rambo mystery is finally solved, and the truth isn't good. 1. Hallelujah and heartache. Before the gold records, before the Grammys, before the tragedy, there was just Joyce Reba Luttrell, a small-town Kentucky girl with calloused fingers, a weather-beaten guitar, and a voice so hauntingly pure that pastors called it a gift from God. But for Dottie Rambo, as she would later be known, divine favor came tethered to earthly suffering. From the beginning, her life teetered on a paradox. The more the world praised her for her faith, the more invisible her pain became. She was 13 when she wrote her first song, a hymn of surrender, a plea disguised as praise. Even then, her lyrics carried the weight of someone who had seen too much, felt too deeply. By the time she was in her 20s, she was already being called the Queen of Gospel Songwriting, her name whispered with reverence in Southern churches and Nashville boardrooms alike. But behind the pulpit smile was a woman being devoured by the very ministry that claimed to love her. Dottie's husband, Buck Rambo, was her manager and spiritual partner. Their daughter Reba, too, would be drawn into the spotlight, forming a family gospel trio that looked, from the outside, like a Southern Baptist fairy tale. But to those close to the Rambos, the dynamic was suffocating. Dottie's devotion to faith, family, and music masked the slow erosion of her autonomy. She was the talent. She was the engine. But the machine ran on someone else's terms. There were whispers even then, murmurs among musicians, church staff, session players, that Dottie was overworked, that she was not seeing the royalties she deserved, that contracts were being signed without her full consent. But in the world of Southern gospel, loyalty was currency, and speaking against the industry's golden family was sacrilege. So she smiled, she toured, she wrote the songs that would define generations, and she kept the wounds to herself. 2. The voice that heaven claimed. It wasn't just the lyrics, it was the tremble in her voice, the way she bent a note like a prayer breaking in half. Dottie Rambo wasn't just a gospel singer, she was gospel incarnate, a living vessel for the brokenhearted and the hopeful. Her songs were sung in hospital rooms, prison cells, revival tents, and funerals. They were the soundtrack of salvation. But what no one saw, or chose not to see, was that Dottie herself was unraveling. By the 1970s, her fame had become a gilded cage. She had written over 2,500 songs, recorded countless albums, and shared the stage with Elvis Presley, Johnny Cash, and Barbara Mandrell. And yet, despite all her success, she was largely dependent on others, for bookings, for income, for legal decisions. Her name was on the records, but the power was never hers. There were multiple instances where her songs were used without proper credit or adequate compensation. Publishing rights were shuffled between companies with connections to her inner circle. Lawsuits were threatened but never filed. Those who dared to question the system were shut out. Dottie, meanwhile, was encouraged to sit in the Lord's hands. This spiritual gaslighting was not uncommon in the gospel industry, especially for women, especially for someone like Dottie, a woman whose faith was her brand, whose suffering was her sermon. Any public confrontation would be framed as bitterness, a lack of humility, so she buried it, again and again. And then there was the accident. In 1989, a fall from a stage fractured her back in 3 places. The injury nearly paralyzed her and left her in chronic pain for the rest of her life. For most, it would have been a career-ending blow. But Dottie kept performing, strapped in back braces, praying through tears between sets. And still, the money didn't add up. Behind the voice that heaven claimed was a woman the industry was quietly bleeding dry. 3. The contracts signed in shadows. The contracts weren't just bad, they were catastrophic. In the early 90s, Dottie Rambo made a quiet return to the business side of her music. She was older, slower, but more alert. The injuries had sharpened her discernment. She began asking questions about song rights, about publishing, about where the money was going. What she found was a paper trail of silence, manipulation, and missing royalties dating back decades. Some of her most beloved compositions, He Looked Beyond My Fault and Sheltered in the Arms of God, were found to be generating revenue for companies she didn't fully control. Rights had been transferred under the guidance of former managers, some family-adjacent, some with heavy influence in the Christian music industry. Deals that should have guaranteed her a comfortable retirement had been quietly rewritten in favor of corporate interests. There was also the matter of ghostwriters and unacknowledged collaborators, people who claimed to have co-written songs with Dottie but were never credited. Some had signed non-disclosure agreements. Others feared legal retaliation. When asked, Dottie would only say, "The Lord knows the truth," but the wear on her face told a different story. The final betrayal, however, came from within. A member of her own inner circle, someone she had trusted implicitly, had allegedly redirected a significant portion of her publishing royalties through shell companies and handshake deals. The arrangement was buried in legalese, hidden in years of opaque accounting. When Dottie threatened to go public, she was warned, gently, spiritually, and then legally. "Don't ruin what God has built," one letter read. By the time she realized how deep it all went, it was too late. The machine had already devoured the girl from Kentucky, and all that remained was the myth, clean, holy, untouchable. But the truth was still there, buried in the shadows, waiting. 4. Sanctified and silenced. In the gospel world, sin is expected, but only in men. Women are held to sainthood. For Dottie Rambo, the pressure to maintain a pristine image grew suffocating. She was not just a performer, she was a symbol of faith, perseverance, divine favor. And in that role, there was no space for confrontation, no room to demand justice. To speak out would be to betray the very persona the industry had built around her. So when Dottie began pushing back on money, on credit, on control, she was quietly, methodically erased. Industry events that once headlined her name began to omit it. Collaborators who owed their careers to her influence suddenly stopped returning calls. Promoters cited health concerns, though she continued to tour. Awards committees passed her over for lifetime achievement recognitions. Radio play dropped. Bookings thinned. She hadn't sinned. She had simply stopped being useful. There were murmurs of a blacklist, whispers that she was difficult, confused, even ungodly. All veiled language meant to discredit without confrontation. Dottie's calls for financial clarity were reframed as bitterness. Her demand for credit became vanity. Her exhaustion, the toll of decades of physical pain and emotional betrayal, was labeled instability. And through it all, she kept writing, quietly, painfully. In one unpublished journal entry discovered after her death, she wrote, "They wanted my voice, but not my voice, only the part that served them." No one in the industry ever publicly confirmed the silencing, but many privately admitted it. She had become too dangerous, not for her sins, but for her truth. 5. When family becomes a brand. Reba Rambo had once been the apple of her mother's eye, a soaring soprano with the stage presence of a pop star and the spiritual legacy of gospel royalty. Together, Dottie and Reba represented the generational torch of faith and music. But fame is a wedge, and for the Rambos, the spotlight turned familial love into a product. As Reba's own star rose in the 1980s and 90s, tensions simmered beneath the surface. She began to shift musically, leaning into contemporary Christian styles, collaborating with artists outside the traditional gospel sphere. Her audience grew younger, broader, but her mother's fan base viewed these changes with suspicion. To many in the conservative gospel world, Reba's evolution felt like rebellion. Dottie, caught in the crossfire, was forced to choose between protecting her daughter's future and preserving her own base. Behind the scenes, their relationship strained under the weight of business, shared royalties, touring contracts, branding decisions. Reba was not just Dottie's daughter. She was also her product, her partner, her successor. And when family becomes enterprise, affection is no longer unconditional. There were rumors of legal disputes, quiet, sealed, never confirmed, regarding the division of catalog rights. Unspoken resentment mounted. They stopped performing together. Interviews grew tense. Statements were phrased carefully. Dottie was left isolated, emotionally and financially. The industry she helped build had shut its doors. The daughter she raised into the spotlight was now navigating it without her, and the songs she poured her soul into were generating profits she rarely saw. A family that once stood as a shining example of faith and unity had become the very symbol of what happens when gospel turns to business. 6. The gospel according to greed. By the early 2000s, the gospel music industry was booming. Multi-million-dollar conferences, televised award shows, branded merchandise, mega-church tours. Southern gospel, once a grassroots, tent revival tradition, had become an empire. And empires, as Dottie Rambo learned, do not build themselves on honesty. She watched as younger artists sang her songs on stages she was no longer invited to. Compilation albums were released without her input. Licensing deals were brokered without her signature. Her name was invoked in speeches, in liner notes, in tributes, yet she saw none of the benefits. Behind the curtain, a network of publishing companies, church-connected investors, and label executives ensured that the money kept moving, just not in her direction. Her music, her story, her legacy were now commodities in a marketplace she no longer controlled. One former associate would later say, "Dottie was a saint to the fans and a ledger to the suits." There were quiet settlements, royalty disputes settled out of court, former business partners who returned long-lost rights, but only after public pressure. Dottie remained composed, gracious in interviews, always deflecting questions about money with spiritual platitudes. But in private, she was heartbroken. She once told a confidant, "They used the gospel to gut me." Still, she wrote, songs full of grace, of longing, of weariness, songs that hinted, ever so slightly, at betrayal, at regret, at injustice. She knew she would never get back what was taken, but she kept creating, as if to remind the world who the real author had been all along. And then came the wreck, the moment that would end it all and begin the final chapter of the mystery. 7. Bruised knees and broken deals. It happened on May 11, 2008. A tour bus veering off the road in Missouri. One fatality, Dottie Rambo. The headline was sanitized, "Legendary gospel singer dies in accident." What it didn't say, what it couldn't say, was how many collisions led to that one. Physical, financial, spiritual. That final wreck wasn't just a highway tragedy. It was a crescendo of exhaustion, chronic injury, and a tour schedule she never should have been on. At 74 years old, Dottie was still performing up to 5 times a week. Her spine was riddled with complications from the decades-old fall. She relied on painkillers just to move. Friends begged her to slow down, but she refused. Or rather, she couldn't. The money wasn't there. The royalties had dried up. The settlements had come too late. She needed the road. Some close to her believed she was pushed, gently, subtly, by those who continued to benefit from her name. Bookings were framed as revivals, contracts as ministry opportunities. She was told the fans needed her, that the Lord still had plans for her voice. But the truth was simpler. Her body was failing, and there was no financial safety net. The bus wasn't hers. The tour wasn't hers. Even the merchandise sold on-site often funneled profits elsewhere. She was the brand, but not the owner. In the aftermath, the gospel world mourned her like a matriarch. Candlelight vigils, tribute concerts, tearful interviews. But behind the scenes, a scramble had already begun to claim catalog rights, to secure licensing deals, to stake claims in the remnants of her estate. She had died with little more than the clothes she wore, and the songs in her head. 8. Bus wreck or burnout? The official investigation ruled it an accident. The bus had failed to navigate a sharp curve, poor road conditions, mechanical failure, no charges filed. End of story. But to those who knew her best, it was a slow-motion collapse, years in the making. Dottie's health had been in sharp decline. Her schedule had been relentless, and the support system meant to protect her, spiritually and professionally, had failed her utterly. Why was a severely injured woman in her 70s still touring? Why were her medical costs not covered by decades of publishing success? Why had no gospel association, label, or ministry stepped in to fund her retirement? The answers were buried in contracts, in years of exploitation disguised as devotion, in handshake deals that left her with nothing, in the kind of spiritual gaslighting that tells an artist their suffering is part of their calling. The truth no one wanted to say out loud was this: Dottie Rambo's death was not just a crash, it was a culmination, a martyrdom by mismanagement. In private circles, some began whispering what others feared to admit, that the gospel industry had consumed one of its greatest voices, and then moved on. Her catalog was reissued, her story canonized, but the reality of her final years was sanitized beyond recognition. A bus wreck was easier to grieve than a life of spiritual exploitation. 9. The widow's lawsuit. Months after the funeral, silence gave way to paper. Reba Rambo, now the sole heir to Dottie's legacy, began filing documents. There were licensing disputes, trademark registrations, legal filings that hinted at long-standing financial discrepancies. It wasn't framed as revenge. It was framed as preservation. But beneath the legal jargon was grief laced with fury. Reba had lived through the silencing. She had seen her mother work through broken vertebrae, sing through tremors of pain. She had watched as companies profited from Dottie's image, her voice, her faith, all while cutting her out of the loop. And now, with her mother gone, she was determined not to let the pattern continue. At the heart of the legal battle was a single question: who owned Dottie Rambo? The answer wasn't simple. Decades of muddled contracts, shell companies, and handshake deals made it nearly impossible to untangle the web. Some companies claimed partial ownership of her catalog. Others contested the rights to her image and likeness. One even attempted to trademark her name posthumously. The fight was ugly and quiet. There were no press conferences, no dramatic court showdowns, just a slow, grinding battle waged through paperwork and back channels. Reba, it seemed, had inherited not just her mother's voice, but her war. And like Dottie, she faced it largely alone. 10. Legacy on trial. Today, Dottie Rambo is remembered as a gospel legend. Her name sits beside icons, her songs are etched into hymnals, her voice still played on Sunday mornings across the South. But the real legacy is messier. She was a woman who gave everything, her talent, her body, her silence, to an industry that built itself on her back. She was canonized by those who once erased her, quoted by those who ignored her cries, immortalized in tribute albums by voices who stood silent while she was suffering. And even now, the mystery isn't solved. Not really. Because the mystery was never just the accident, or the contracts, or the betrayal. The real mystery is how a woman could be so powerful in song, and yet so powerless in life. How a voice so beloved could be so consistently silenced. There are still royalties in dispute, still rights in question, still truths that have never been publicly aired. But Dottie Rambo's story endures, not because of the industry, but in spite of it. She sang of heaven, but she walked through hell. And now, perhaps for the first time, the truth is finally being heard. Outro. If the truth about Dottie Rambo was hidden to protect something bigger, what else are we choosing not to see? Now that the mystery is no longer a mystery, do we confront what it reveals, or let silence win again? Share your thoughts below while we still can. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.